Rabbi Wieder is a prolific scholar with more than 900 lectures on Judaism captured on audio and video and available online. He graduated summa cum laude from Yeshiva College and received an MS in American Jewish History from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. He also holds a PhD in Judaic Studies from New York University. Tonight, Rabbi Wieder will focus on two aspects of racism through the prism of Torah. First, he will give us a halakhic, hashkafic evaluation of racism towards specific ethnic groups and towards non-Jews more generally. Second, he will discuss the spiritual character deficiencies implied in the bearers of racist beliefs. Following the presentation, the moderator will post questions entered online to Rabbi Wieder. It is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Jeremy Wieder.
Thank you, Josh. Before Shavua Tov, before I begin, I think I would be remiss if not making public note of the passing of one of the most articulate spokespeople for modern Orthodoxy, Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sacks, who has been a voice, an incredibly articulate voice of so many of the things that are important to our community in the world. He will be dearly missed. Yehi zichro baruch. Tonight, in discussing the issue of racism, I wanted to actually add a little bit to the presentation. I want to sort of present three angles. The first is, as the flyer suggested, halakhic and hashkafic approach to this question. And the second is a little bit of a historical observation, just thinking about Jewish history. And finally, to speak about it from the vantage point of our character as human beings. Before I begin those three parts, I want to present a few introductory points. I'm not going to evaluate the extent of the existence of racism in the modern Orthodox community. And I'm really going to limit my remarks to the modern Orthodox community. It's the community I'm part of and the community I know. But racism certainly exists, and I'm pretty sure it's not marginal. When I spoke a number of years ago after the death, or maybe perhaps better said, the killing of Eric Garner, some of the feedback I got suggested to me that very clearly I wasn't wrong in assuming the fact that racism was very much alive in the modern Orthodox community. I do think it's important in talking about this issue to note that sometimes it's not difficult to explain racism in the Orthodox community. And I want to be clear, explaining doesn't mean justify. Explaining just means thinking about some of the things that leads to it. When we talk about the issue of racism towards non-Jews in general, our historical experience with Christendom and Islam and the persecution of Jews for hundreds of years, and I don't mean to be guilty of what the late great professor of Jewish history, Sela Brown, commented, the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Not all of Jewish history was tear-filled. Nonetheless, there was more than enough persecution in the last 1,500 years of the Jewish community, while you might understand why Jews would have some pretty negative attitudes towards non-Jews. I think more recently in America, in the 60s and 70s in particular, when neighborhoods in certain cities turned bad and Jews, in a sense, were forced to flee or had very negative experiences at the hands of people who were lawless or expressed anti-Semitism, that also shapes the views of people. That's not a justification, it's not a defense, but I think it's important at least to take note of that. And perhaps I think the most important point in this entire discussion, and this is true not only about this discussion, but many contemporary issues, is the importance of nuance and complexity in dealing with these issues. And it's very hard, I find this very hard to find in all sorts of discussions. An individual can agree with the grievances of Black Lives Matter, even if one doesn't agree with all of its aims or with every proposed solution. I'm not telling somebody that they should or shouldn't support the movement. I understand why somebody would support the movement, even with reservations about stances on things that are irrelevant to the major issues. I understand why someone would support in principle the movement, even though they will not support it publicly because of their association with, and their official platform of things related to Israel or other kinds of things. And I think both perspectives are valid. And I don't think that someone is wrong because they've taken one side or the other. I think that when we look at current events, I think it's really important also to recognize that in many of the events that have shocked us, of blacks dying at the hands of police, not all events are the same. There are cases that I think are very clear-cut, like George Floyd and Eric Garner and Walter Scott. And then there are cases that are not clear, that maybe something was wrong, maybe something wasn't, like Michael Brown. And then there are cases probably in the end when you dig down underneath all the facts, when all the smoke is blown away, such as Breonna Taylor, which are incredibly tragic, but in some ways accidental. But that there is a problem is very hard to deny. And sometimes I encounter people who believe that there really are no such problems. And I would say the following: when I occasionally read citations from people who deny the Holocaust, an event that I didn't experience, I'm not the child, my parents were born in America, and when I read such denials, it makes my blood boil. It's infuriating. I have to imagine that if you were to talk to a black person who had been pulled over by the police for driving numerous times, for driving pulled over for no cause other than they were a black person driving a fancy car, to deny the experience that people have lived must also be infuriating. I can't tell you the extent of it, but it's very real. And I would urge people, those who are inclined to dismiss, I think people should educate themselves to the history of the treatment of blacks after slavery ended. No, from Jim Crow to segregation to redlining, and the list actually goes on and on. Most of us who haven't experienced it, who don't live in communities that have experienced this type of discrimination and persecution, we're just not even aware of what the reality is. And I want to stress again, in terms of nuance, not every solution proposed is a good idea. You can talk about something like affirmative action. I understand, and I may feel that way, have deep reservations about it on multiple levels. But just because one doesn't like a particular solution, I still think denying the existence of the problem is unconscionable. There are two kinds of racism that I think one can sort of break things down into. The first is ethnic racial, and the other is religious. The first one, the ethnic racial discrimination, which is really the one that we're talking about in our current events, and I think why I was asked to address this topic, that essentially has no basis in Jewish tradition. There is no source that would suggest in any way that halacha would in any way discriminate against, let's use the term, a person of color. I'm aware of only one source which maybe indicates something, but I'm not even sure that it does. It's a source that is fairly obscure, and it doesn't really have much discussion even in the commentaries. Not that they would have necessarily been so shocked. Is the first source on the sheet, which is the Mishnah in Bechoros. The Mishnah in Bechoros in the 7th parak is listing the various disqualifications or blemishes that would disqualify a priest, the Kohen, from performing the avodah, the service in the temple. And the Mishnah lists there the following: Hakushi, which we usually assume to refer to someone who's black, literally Ethiopian. A Gichar, a Lavkan are two other individuals, one of whom is very, very light-skinned. And then they go on to list other things as well, a Kipeach, Ananas, people who are very, very short, and so on. And the Mishnah says that such a person is Pasal Avodah. It is a very narrow issue. It's not clear what the reason for this is. And I'm not sure that it actually refers to someone who was actually African as much as someone whose skin is abnormally dark. In the same way that the Gichar is someone whose skin is abnormally light. So I'm not sure that it's even relevant. But this is the only source that I'm aware of in a fairly obscure context. And I think it's worth pointing out in the Mishnah itself is that when you talk about the two extremes of someone who's very dark and very light, so Jews in the Second Temple period were neither black nor Nordic. Jews were probably like Middle Easterners. They were probably swarthy. And so I'm not sure that one can read anything into this Mishnah. What one can say, certainly, though, from a halakhic perspective, is that I'll start really with Jews, to treat a Jew of color in any way in a discriminatory fashion would violate any number of Torah prohibitions. For starters, the prohibition of what's known of onas dvarim, v'lo sonu isha samiso, v'yaresa melokecha, the inflicting of emotional pain upon another, certainly a Jew, not another human being, is categorically prohibited. The mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is colorblind. It doesn't make a difference what Jew you're talking about. And I'll actually come back to that a little bit later towards the end. It also is the case very commonly, not always, but the Jews of color are often Gerim or children of Gerim. And we're not really sure where all of them are, but the Gemara in Bava Tzia makes reference to the fact that in, 36 or 37 places, the Torah warns about ono'as hager, about inflicting emotional pain on a convert. This is on top of a general prohibition of inflicting emotional pain on any other member of our community. The Torah says, "V'haftem es hager, ki gerim ha'isem be'eretz Mitzrayim." You should love the ger because we were strangers in Egypt. The ger lo soneh v'lo sochatzenu, the prohibition of inflicting emotional pain or persecuting a ger, ki gerim ha'isem be'eretz Mitzrayim. And I should add in this context an observation I think that is very much salient, even if it's not directly applicable, although often it is. Even when dealing with a person who is not of color, who is not actually a convert, if they are a descendant of converts, which is much more likely to be the case, even if they're not, there is a prohibition as well. That person is treated like a ger. Rashi quotes in Parshas Yisro a Gemara in the last parak of Sanhedrin. It says, "Vayichad Yisro," when Moshe Rabbeinu describes the downfall of the Egyptians to his father-in-law Yisro. So it says Vayichad Yisro. The simple meaning of the verse is that Yisro rejoiced, like the word chedva. However, Rav and Shmuel actually have a different interpretation, and Shmuel says Shenase chidudim kol besaro, that Yisro had some very strong reaction, like an emotional gut reaction to the death, to the drowning of the Egyptians. And Rav comments on that the fact that Yisro in some way viscerally responded negatively, he felt some shuddering or pain over the death of the Egyptians. So Rav says this is the common proverb, Ki yura ad asara dare lo tavaze aramai kame. A ger, even 10th generation, someone who was many generations removed from his roots of conversion, you should not make nasty comments about non-Jew in his presence, because he will feel it, because he will still have that sense of being a descendant of converts, and it will still have a very negative impact upon that person. So I think that is an issue that is certainly relevant, even in the case where a person of color is not actually a convert. They are likely to be someone who has a heightened sensitivity to those outside of our community who might share some of their life experiences. Now, that's really all I think there is to say about halacha. I think it's fairly clear. I do want to talk very briefly about one particular Agadic comment, which is actually totally wrong. One may find here and there an Agadic source which engage in stereotyping of various groups of people. And that will include in a few places what we would say Kushim, Ethiopians, which would be the blacks that Chazal would likely have come in contact with. I think it is important to note, however, that these are mostly obscure sources. They're not normative, and I think maybe most important, I don't think that they're influential. There is one source that I think is worthy of mention because it's wrong. There is an association of black and slavery that people often assume to exist. This association of blackness and slavery does not actually originate in Jewish sources. It originates in Islam, as Islam was involved in its formation of spreading around and actually in large amounts of slave trading, and a large number of these slaves were black. That's where the first justification, somehow trying to connect blackness and slavery, exists. Some have this idea that Ham was cursed by Noah, and Ham was dark, and therefore, and Ham was cursed by Noah, and his descendants are slaves. There is this idea that floats around. Ibn Ezra, I apologize, I didn't put it on the source sheet, but I will read it to you. Ibn Ezra writes in Parshas Noach, when Noach curses not Ham, he curses Canaan. Ham had 4 sons, Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, Canaan. Those were the 4 sons. Noach curses only his 4th son. Ibn Ezra understands the expression when Noach says, Eved avadim yeleh achav, servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. It doesn't mean that Canaan or Ham or any of them would be servants to Shem and Yefes, but rather that Canaan would be a servant or would be a slave to his brothers, Cush, Mitzrayim, and Put. Ibn Ezra writes then, as sort of out of nowhere, V'yesh omrim ki hakushim heim avadim, that the blacks are slaves, and Ibn Ezra is probably aware of this reality that it must be common in the world that he knows. Ba'avur shekilal Noach es Ham, because Noach cursed Ham. That's what Ibn Ezra quotes, and he says it's wrong. V'hinei shachachu, they forgot, ki hamelech harishon achar hamabul hayamikush. The first king after the flood, and the first king recorded, at least in biblical history, was Nimrod, who was the son of Cush. And Ibn Ezra doesn't spell it out, but of course, what he's implying is the idea that the kingship should come from a tribe of slaves is ridiculous. And the fact is, Noach didn't curse Ham, and he cursed Cush. And whatever the reasons for that, he cursed Canaan. Whatever the reasons for that, there is no biblical or rabbinic association, certainly in any early sources, with Cush and slavery. That's a later justification invented, again, not originally in Jewish sources, in order to defend or to explain black slavery. And I think, in fact, when you look at slavery in the Roman world, and you look at slavery in Chazal, in rabbinic sources, there is no association between slavery and blackness. Slavery was whoever had misfortune of being captured in war or having been kidnapped, by bandits. There is absolutely no association between darkness and slavery. So in that sense, I'm not suggesting that slavery is a good institution, but in Chazal's world, slavery was race blind. I think, as I said before, I don't think any sources in Chazal are responsible for racism found in the Orthodox community, certainly not in the modern Orthodox community. I think that racism in our community is much more likely to be driven, even in certain cases, by historical experience, or more likely by cultural influences of the socioeconomic class in which our community is situated. And I think that thinking that if Agadic sources were silent, or if even they spoke negatively of racism, it would be transformative, I believe is wishful thinking. You can find comments of the Rav and Rav Aaron Soloveitchik and other Gedolim condemning ethnic racism, but I believe that racists in our community would conjure up many excuses to ignore them. So that's I think, so I would say, in dealing with the question of ethnic or race-based racism, I think that the halacha provides no justification, no defense of it. In many cases, one would violate prohibitions. And I would add that I assume whatever our obligations of treatment of non-Jews of B'nai Noach, again, applies equally across races. It's colorblind. The second kind of racism, which is one that really I'm not going to focus on tonight, is actually a much more serious and halakhic moral challenge. But it's not the issue, I think, that the modern Orthodox community faces. Perhaps it exists a little bit on the right edge of the modern Orthodox community because it's a much more serious issue in the Haredi world. I would suggest the following. When modern Orthodox Jews cheat in business and taxes, and I don't know, I can't assess, whether modern Orthodox Jews are more or less, honest in business than Haredi Orthodox Jews. I know there's a stereotype, it might or might not be true, but one thing I'm pretty sure about, that when modern Orthodox Jews cheat in business and taxes, it's because they're dishonest, not because they think that it is permissible al pi halacha to swindle the government or non-Jews. They cheat because they're dishonest, not because they see religious justification. So while there are some very, very serious issues that are raised, much more substantive issues in terms of discrimination against non-Jews, that's not the issue that I want to address tonight. I think it's an important issue, but it's for a different context. Historically speaking, and this is not, I would say, my specialty, but I feel, because of things that I've heard said, the necessity to really comment on this. There are probably few, if any, groups in human history who have suffered as much as the Jewish people because of racism. And I think that this should make an impression upon us. Anti-Semitism at some point morphs. It's not clear whether this starts begins the process in the post-expulsion period of Spain with the Limpieza de Sangre, or is it a post-Enlightenment phenomenon? But it certainly culminates in the Holocaust, a transition from religious racism against Jews, if we can use that term, to racial, I would say from religious anti-Semitism to racial anti-Semitism. And I comment about this, the importance of the sensitivity that every Jew should have on this matter when people start to raise what I'll call scientific theories, which abounded in Nazi Germany about differences between groups, that we as a people have suffered enormously. And I think it's worth drawing your attention to what I think is an incredibly important book. It was written a long time ago, but it was written in response to racial theories of the early 20th century, which I want to comment on for just a minute, and how it affected the Jewish people. But it anticipated many of the modern arguments of genetic differences between races of the bell curve variety. Ever since Darwin, scientists, I don't even want to say pseudoscientists because some of them were supposedly leading scientists of the day, have been engaged in peddling theories of racial differences and genetic differences, inherent differences between races. There's a book that I highly recommend. It's not an easy read, or some of it's not an easy read. It's called The Mismeasure of Man by one of my favorite authors, Stephen Jay Gould. And he really presents an analysis of the history of attempts to try to find differences between races. And I'm only going to focus on one particular aspect because it had devastating consequences for the Jewish people. In 1917, when the United States was preparing for war, so the Army allowed extensive intelligence testing, whatever that means, on all the Army recruits. And the outcome of these experiments or these evaluations wound up demonstrating the superior intelligence of those who were descendants of Nordic races and the inferior intelligence of those of Southern and Eastern European extraction. Now, in the post-World War I period, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, maybe even before that. And in 1924, there was a major restriction of immigration that was passed in the United States. The influence of the examinations that were done before World War I had played a seminal role in terms of the quotas of where immigrants would be admitted from, with significant restrictions from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, you can translate Jews. And I just wanted to read to you briefly a paragraph from one of the people who was responsible, who later in 1930 recanted his scholarship and said it was all totally wrong. And the differences between the various recruits had more to do with literacy and how long they had been in the United States rather than any innate intelligence. So Stephen Jay Gould writes about him that the Brigham, C.C. Brigham, who was a professor at Princeton, had paid his personal debt by admitting his incorrect scholarship, but he could not undo what the test had accomplished. The quota stood and slowed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe to a trickle. Throughout the 1930s, Jewish refugees anticipating the Holocaust sought to emigrate but were not admitted. The legal quotas and continuing eugenical propaganda barred them even in years when inflated quotas for Western and Northern European nations were not filled. Chase, in 1977, has estimated that the quotas barred up to 6 million Southern, Central, and Eastern Europeans between 1924 and the outbreak of World War II, assuming that immigration had continued at its pre-1924 rate. We know what happened to many who wished to leave but had nowhere to go. Many of us are related to those people. The paths to destruction are often indirect, but ideas can be agents as sure as guns and bombs. We, as a people, have suffered greatly from what we would all acknowledge as pseudo-scientific racism. I think we should be very careful before ever tolerating attempts to go down that road. The last aspect that I wanted to approach, and to me, which I think in some ways is the most important, is the question of character. What does racism say about the character of people who subscribe to racist views? What does it say about their humanity, their empathy, and their humility? I begin with humanity. At the core of Torah is the humanity that is attached to every human being. We read a few weeks ago in Parshas Bereishis, Vayivra Elokim es Adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elokim bara oso zachar u'nekeva bara osam. God created human beings in the image of God. I've been asked on occasion in talking about related topics, is this not some type of halakhic principle? And my answer is, technically it's not, although it plays a major role, which I can't talk about tonight, in shaping many aspects of biblical law. The only thing in the Torah that is explicitly linked to the fact that every human being is endowed with an Tzelem Elokim is Shofech Dam Ha'adam Ba'adam Damo Yishafech Ki B'Tzelem Elokim Asas Adam. The punishment for murder is that a person is to be put to death, because killing of a human being is a totally separate kind of crime than anything else, because humans were created in the image of God. In effect, killing another human being without justification is a crime against God unparalleled. And Tzelem Elokim, this idea, is something which is assumed to be true of every single human being. The Mishnah Avos says, Hu haya omer chaviv adam shenivra b'tzelem, chiba yisera nodas lo shenivra b'tzelem, shenemar b'tzelem Elokim asas adam. And then the Mishnah goes on to talk about Chavivim Yisrael shenikru banim lamakom. The normative approach, if I can use that term, to understanding this Mishnah has classically been that Tzelem Elokim, the Mishnah here, Adam, refers to every single human being. I would be not fully open if I didn't acknowledge that there is a difficult and a distinctly minority view of this Mishnah. It's a later interpretation, the Marami Prague, who wants to argue that Adam in the Mishnah refers to only Jews. Unfortunately, this particular opinion has become more popular in certain circles, even modern Orthodox circles, in recent years. I noticed this over my years in yeshiva. Unfortunately, some of our students have brought it back from Eretz Yisrael. They brought it back from the time in Israel. In Israel, unfortunately, my sense is that the Maharal's view has achieved greater prominence because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in an unfortunate way, is an outgrowth of racism towards Arabs. And that's not a statement about who is guilty in Israel, for causing most of the problems. But no matter what one thinks, racism towards any human beings is deeply problematic. I understand why. It's not hard for me to understand why someone has witnessed terror attacks, people being blown up. One is furious. One may naturally grasp for certain kinds of traditional sources. I believe the Maharal Prague in this context represents a distinct outlier in the Jewish tradition. It is certainly not pshat in the Mishnah. So the idea, there is an idea which is relevant to all human beings, Jews and non-Jews, people of all races, that every human being is of equal and infinite value because every human being is endowed with the Tzelem Elokim. And our responsibility in terms of recognizing people's humanity is not simply refraining from killing people. When we are part of a society which hasn't taken the steps to protect human life, we are guilty as well. And the Gemara in Sota, and it's quoted by Rashi at the end of Parshas Shoftim, in the Parsha, in the Halacha of Egla Rufa. So the Gemara notes there that we read, and this is the fourth source on the Roman numeral 2, the Gemara in Sota, Tanu Rabbanan v'chol ziknei ha'ir ahi hakrovim el hachalol, yirchatzu es yidehem al ha'egla rufa banachal. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk, and then the next line says, the elders say, V'amru yadeinu lo shafchu as adam hazeh ve'einenu lo ra'u. The elders of the Beis Din, of the local Beis Din, say, our hands did not spill this blood, and our eyes did not see it being spilled. The Gemara says, V'chi al libenu also shebeis din shofchem damin. Would the Torah thought that anybody would think that the elders, that the judges, were responsible for spilling the blood of this person who was found murdered in the middle of nowhere? Ela lo ba liyodenu upitarnu below mizonos, v'lo re'inuhu v'inachnu below levaya. We didn't encounter him and send him on his way without providing provisions, which maybe somehow contributed to his being killed. And we didn't see him and failed to accompany him to provide him with safe passage. So the Torah demands the bringing of an Egla Rufa and a public profession of innocence from people who you would never have thought were guilty, not because they might have been guilty of actually shedding blood biyadayim actively, but because even standing by when you have the power to protest and prevent things, we are responsible, not with the same level of punishment, but we are morally culpable and responsible when we fail to protect or to prevent the shedding of innocent blood. So that is as far as our responsibility in terms of humanity, to turn away from the cries of people who are suffering as from being targets of racism is a denial of their humanity, in some ways a denial of our own humanity. The second issue is empathy. And the pasuk in Mishlei perhaps captures it in its classic pithy fashion perfectly. Otem ozno mizak hasdal kam hu yikrav lo yeoneh. The person who closes his ears to the crying out of the poor, of the oppressed, of the marginal, that person too will call out in their time of need and won't be answered. The Torah, in his introduction to the laws of tzedakah, writes, "V'yesh la'adam litein el libo," a person should consider, "Shekemo shemevakesh b'chol shamei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, sheyazmin lo parnasaso." You always ask God to provide your livelihood. U'chemo shemevakesh me'HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheyishma shavaso, that God should hearken to our prayers. Kach tzarech sheyishma shavas anim. You have to listen to the pleadings and the sufferings of others. And v'afkam zosha Kadosh Baruch Hu karov l'shmo atzakas aniyim. God listens first to the crying out of the marginalized, of the poor, of the impoverished. Shenemar shavas aniyim atos ishma. God, you hear the voice of the oppressed. Lefikach yesh lo lizar mizakasam. You should be very, very careful about it. The Torah later comments at the end of the next line that you should remember that you close your ears now when other people need. There will come a time you will be in need. Your child, your grandchild will be in need. You want to create a world of empathy where you care for others because others will hear your suffering as well. But I think that perhaps the best expression of this is in a very famous story of Hillel. And when one boils down what Hillel tells the convert in the story that many of you, I'm sure, know, Hillel describes the core principle of Torah as empathy. Empathy means putting yourself in another person's position. And I think many of you know the story, the convert, the non-Jew who came to convert, and he said to Shammai, he said, "Convert me. I want you to convert me if you can teach me the Torah while I'm standing on one foot." Shammai drives him out. He chases him out. He comes to Hillel. Hillel says, "Fine." He says, standing on one foot, that which is unpleasant for you, don't do to somebody else. This is the embodiment of empathy, is to understand what it is to be in someone else's shoes. If you were experiencing what they were experiencing, how would you react? And that means that don't do it to them. The Torah is replete with references, particularly in Sefer Dvarim, but not only, of mitzvos that are connected to the fact that we experience something in Mitzrayim, and therefore we should be sensitive of causing other people to have the same experience. We're told for many of the gifts to the poor, to the ger, to the yasom, to the almana, that b'zochar toki even hayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim. We're told to be sensitive to the ger, v'ger lo suchatz v'yatem yadatem es nefesh hager, ki gerim hayisem be'eretz Mitzrayim. This is the embodiment of empathy, is to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand what it must feel like. But perhaps the most important quality, the one that I think may be necessary for some of us, for all of us to understand in various circumstances, is what I would term humility. And let me explain. We recite every day in Kedusha de Sidra, in what we call the Valatzion. We say at the end, Baruch Hu Elokeinu shebra'anu l'chvodo, v'hivdilanu in atoim, v'nosan lanu taras emes, v'chaye olam nata b'sochenim. We are partisans. We are chauvinists. We believe that Torah is the only true revelation of God. We believe that the only true religion is Judaism. Now that would be an opportunity to become arrogant. In Parshas Vayeschanan, Moshe Rabbeinu warns the Jewish people. He says, it's not because we're so great. We don't actually deserve it. And what we say here in Kedusha de Sidra is we thank God we bless him for having created us for his honor, and for God separating us out from those who err by giving us his Torah. It's not something that we did on our own. It's not something that we earned. It's not something that we deserve. If I see a non-Jew I don't look down upon him because he doesn't know the truth of Torah, because I know something, that if God had given his people the Torah, then he would be the Jew and I would be the non-Jew. And one thing that I've learned, I think this is pretty obvious, that the greatest predictor of someone being a Jew who is observant of Torah is being born to two parents who are observant of Torah. Not a guarantee, and it's not the only case, but it's very, very clear that that's the greatest predictor. So if I merit being Jewish, which I do from my perspective, it's not because I'm special or I deserve it, but rather it's a gift from God. And this is true not only when it comes to religion, it's true in every area in life. The Mishnah in Avos describes what is called Midas Sodom. The attitude of Midas Sodom is Shali Shali v'Shalach Shalach. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. We read about the destruction of Sodom today. Sodom, contrary to Christian interpretation and often popular interpretation, has nothing to do with sodomy. The sin of Sodom, as the prophet Yechezkel describes it, is ignoring the poor, is not supporting the poor, is a socially unjust society. And Moshe Rabbeinu warns us about this over and over in Sefer Dvarim. In its perhaps most blunt formulation, in Parshas Ekev, Moshe Rabbeinu tells us that Pen tochal v'savata vatim tovim tivne v'yashavta u'v'karcha v'tzoncha yirbeyun v'chesef v'zahav yirbelach v'chol asher l'cha yirbeh. This might be a description in many ways of large parts of our community and large parts of upper class America. And what happens when you become wealthy? V'ram levavecha v'shachachtas Hashem Elokecha hamotziacha me'eretz Mitzrayim beis abadim. You become arrogant. You lose your sense of humility. You forget God. And as Moshe Rabbeinu continues, you think that the reason why you're successful is because you're better, because you deserve it, because you worked hard, and it's all your own accomplishments. David HaMelech was critiqued by Chazal in a very striking comment in the Gemara Moed Katan, where David gave praise to God. David gave praise to God on the day he was saved from all of his enemies and from Shaul. The Gemara says, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu David, David, Shira ata omer amapalto shel Shaul? You're singing Shira over the downfall of Shaul, and you're being raised up. Ilmale ata Shaul v'hu David, ibadati kama David mipanav. Kadosh Baruch Hu says to David, you're not a bigger tzaddik than he is. You're not even in his league. For whatever the reasons that it had to be this way, Shaul perished, and you now become the king. But it's not because you deserve it. You're not even in Shaul's league. I often hear a certain theme in dealing with communities of color, a notion that people get what they deserve. And the reason why we are situated in the place that we are situated in this society is because we earned it and we deserve it. And others who aren't, it's because they didn't earn it, they don't deserve it. And there probably could be no greater form of avodah zarah from the Torah's perspective. This is exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu describes as forgetting God. The Navi Yirmiyahu warns us, Ko amar Hashem al yishalel chacham b'chachmaso, v'yishalel hagibor b'gvuraso, and al yishalel asher b'ashro. Let the big chacham, the big Talmid Chacham, who's a Gaon, not take such pride in his Torah knowledge. Don't let the person who is strong physically not take pride in his strength, and let the wealthy person not take pride in his wealth. Because the assumption is every one of us who's gotten to our state in life, whether we're a Talmid Chacham, whether we're wealthy, whether we're strong, it's not because we earned it or deserved it. Maybe we did work hard, but there are a lot of other people who worked hard and didn't get there for whatever reasons. The only thing that a person can take pride in is in Haskel v'Yadawa Osi, in choosing to serve God. And so these three things, I think a person who fails to acknowledge the suffering of other groups, a person who might be racist, you cannot be racist and still fail to address the sufferings of other groups, fails on these three basic scores. They fail on the score of recognizing the humanity of all people, which questions their own humanity. It shows a very powerful lack of empathy, of simply putting yourself. What if you had not been born in Highland Park or in Teaneck or in Riverdale or the Five Towns? You had been born in a ghetto in Newark. Would your life situation, would your trajectory have been different? Would you have risen to the state in life that you did if you had been born there? The answer is maybe, but probably not. And if that's the case, empathy and compassion are in order. And finally, it's the question of humility. It's easy to find oneself in a certain place in life and say, I made it, I deserve it, I earned it. But in fact, Moshe Rabbeinu warns us repeatedly not to say, Kochi v'otzem yadi asali asachayal hazeh. And I feel the need to say this, even though for some it might be controversial from both sides of the spectrum. There are people in this world who make bad choices, and cultures in certain communities can become very problematic. But we should ask ourselves, when you find a broken culture in a community, how did it come to be that way? And the truth is, it didn't emerge in a vacuum. Fundamentally speaking, we always need to remind ourselves that if we had been born under a different star, ilmale ata Shaul v'hu David, our choices and our life circumstances might not have been really different. I wanted to close by reading to you just a very small piece of a very powerful sermon. I'm sure you can find the whole sermon online. It was given by another articulate luminary, great voice of modern Orthodoxy, who we lost only a few months ago, Rabbi Dr. Norman Land, Yehi Zichro Baruch. And it was a sermon that he gave in August of 1963 in response to the Civil Rights March on Washington. And Dr. Lamb spoke in this sermon about, it was Parshas Kiseitze, how Chazal say that economic injustice, cheating on weights and measures, is worse than Gilui Arayos. It's worse than incest and adultery. And Dr. Lamb understood that the comment of Chazal that about midos and mishkalos, economic injustice, is really a form of avodah zarah. And I quote to you, he says, the recent Civil Rights March on Washington, which is undoubtedly a high and glorious point in the history of our country, should set us thinking in the same direction. The crux of the issue is not so much, quote, freedom now, close quote, for the Negroes, as self-respect and dignity now for the white majority, which allowed such disgraceful discrimination to continue unabated for 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. He wrote this, remember, almost 60 years ago. It was bad enough when hate-frenzied mobs lynched individual Negroes, but this crime of shvichus damim, of homicide, is exceeded by the greater blot on our record, the methodical economic exploitation of one segment of our population, the systematic oppression of one race as the source of cheap labor, and its designation, and I read this, and in the current pandemic, and in the unemployment statistics, it was like prophecy, and its designation as the first to suffer in any economic recession. When the economy of a great nation is built upon such patent injustice, it is a crime of avodah zarah, it is a breach of faith. It bespeaks lack of faith in God, who is Av Echad L'Chulanu, one Father for all humans, making us all brothers. It is a lack of faith that democracy really can function as its advocates claim for it, and is not merely a propaganda term in power politics. It is a lack of faith that America can live up to its full destiny as a beacon for all peoples, opening new horizons of hope for the oppressed of the whole world. Those comments, almost 60 years ago, resonate very deeply today, and I think they give us a lot to think about.
Wow, Rabbi Wieder, thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I have a few here that are already have started, but I'll offer also that if somebody wants to ask a question themselves, send in the question box that you'd like to ask the question, and I'll do my best to see if I can work the technology to unmute you so you can ask the question yourself. So I'll leave that open to you. If you send me that request, I'll give that a try. In the meantime, I have a couple of comments and questions maybe you can react to. One is, I guess, I think we should all agree that Black lives do matter, but we should also condemn the BLM movement based on its explicit anti-Israel positions. And the same person also subsequently said, I entered that comment because Rabbi Wieder did not distinguish at all between the principle that Black lives matter and the BLM movement. I think he should have done so.
So I can agree to both of those statements. I chose not to address the specifics, but when I made a reference to parts of the agenda that we definitely don't support, that is what the reference was to. So yes, I think that we can condemn the Black Lives Matter movement on their position on Israel, but I should emphasize another point. I generally adopt this position that if I can wholeheartedly endorse the agenda of a group, I don't endorse it, even though I might fight and support many of its causes. I do understand that there are people who will view that aspect of their agenda as peripheral. It's certainly not what receives press. It's not what you see going on in the protests in this country. It's not about Palestinians in Israel. There are people who want to hijack it, it's true. So yes, I can wholeheartedly condemn it. And I choose for that reason not to support, at least formally, Black Lives Matter. But I can also understand someone who says, I think it's so important to raise my voice, and this is the movement that's doing it, and I'm going to support them even though I don't agree with that because I think it's peripheral. I can, as I said, it's not the choice I make, but I can respect both sides. But yes, I do think that one can and should condemn their position on Israel. I do think it's very much marginal in the public discussion in America.
Okay. Rabbi Wieder, do you have any suggestions for how we could address this issue in the Orthodox Jewish community? Should it be done in individual communities or more globally through more universal rabbinic consensus?
So I think that one of the best ways of doing it, and I'm not, this is not my expertise, but the more contact that Orthodox Jews have with blacks, the less likely they are to be racist. When you know someone, when they're not just a picture on a television screen, it's much easier to relate to their humanity. I don't know that this is true. It hasn't been empirically studied, and it may be partially selection biased, but I have a good friend who claims that one of the downsides, obviously I'm a big advocate of students going to Yeshiva University, but claims that one of the, I'll say the advantages when students go to a secular college campus is they tend to be less racist because you actually encounter people of other races, of minority communities, and it's very hard to demonize them and to sort of deny their experience when you actually get to know them. And now, I will stand by my YU bias. I would like to be able to somehow, I think it would be a good idea to replicate that experience for people, because I think there's nothing more than human contact that allows us to dispel stereotypes of all other people, of wherever it's coming from.
Okay. I just passed along a question to you. Can you see it in the chat?
I'm looking. I'm not. I'm going to make my chat bigger. Can I comment on? I see that. I'm not actually sure what I know how Chazal interpret it. I actually don't know what the pasuk actually means there, so it's hard to comment on that. But Chazal simply say that, of course, we're not b'nei kushim, and they have some type of a comment on it, but I don't think it relates, unless the question has something more. I'm not sure that's relevant to our discussion.
Okay, I have some more coming through, so we have more questions.
Okay.
Again,
I apologize if I'm not picking up on the thrust of that question.
Okay. The current platform of the Movement for Black Lives Matter does not seem to refer to Israel or BDS at all. In addition, the BLM movement is more than the one organization called Movement for Black Lives.
So let me state the following. I'm not here to take a position on the organization. I can see from the two questions two different vantage points. I would, firstly, I have said to a lot of people, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement made one very big mistake in public relations, and I don't disagree with them at their core. They should have added one word in. They should have said Black Lives also matter. It's exactly what it means. I know what it means, but if they said it that way, then people couldn't say, what do you mean? Only Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to get into the question of this organization specifically and its exact platform and so on. I tend personally not to put signs on my lawn, but I've certainly, the cause that they have embraced their primary cause, and I don't think anybody can debate what the primary cause is something that is worthy of embracing. I'll let others figure out whether they're comfortable, what exactly that platform says. That's not my, that's not my particular issue.
Very good. Okay, another one. Thank you for presenting this very important topic. How does the rabbi suggest confronting people around a Shabbos table, when we can do that again, when racial jokes or comments come up? Some people have grown up with these embedded ideas from childhood.
So I don't know how to answer that question, because it could be asked about a whole host of things that people would say that would be problematic. It's really a question of how do you engage in the midst of hocheach tochiach, which we're not very good at, right? When someone says, how do you tell something that somebody they said is offensive in a way that they'll actually might listen? And that's how do you, I could say, just think about, leave aside the issues of race. Imagine trying to have a political conversation now between those who are in favor of Biden and those who are in favor of Trump. We know the conversations tend not to go well. We're not very good at those conversations. It's a tragedy. It's very unfortunate. I think this is something similar. How do you communicate to someone that while maybe they're not even thinking about it, they've said something that would be deeply, they might be offensive to you, and to think about what would sound like if there were a black person sitting there or whatever, whomever the comment was aimed at. But so the answer is, in principle, of course the person should be confronted, but it has to be done in a way that's productive. Otherwise, we would say yatsa scharo b'hefsedo. Your gain is offset by the loss.
Okay.
I would say one more comment in that regard, and this might be pointing the finger itself. Rabbis, when comments are made in their presence, have a greater responsibility. Chazal have an expression that's found in the Gemara in Gittin by Kamsa Bar Kamsa, that Bar Kamsa, when he inflicted the damage upon the Jewish people, he did so because he said, when he was humiliated publicly, and Chachamim who were sitting in the meal said nothing, he said, Midashaski Rabbanan Shmamina de Konichalu. The fact that the sages are silent means they approve. So people who are leaders have a greater responsibility, depending on where the comments are made, especially to actually speak up.
Okay, question. How can we support Jews of color who are often invisible in public Jewish life, in leadership, media, etc.?
I don't know. Meaning, I know that it's impossible. We should be colorblind. So how would you treat any Jew? I'll give, I think, is a better analogy where similar problems actually exist. It's not just Jews of color. Converts are an issue as well. We tend to be a community, the stereotype. I did go for a month to Camp Marasha many years ago, but people would describe the shul which I daven. I don't think this is true anymore, but they would complain when they first moved in, there were cliques of people, if you had gone to camp with so-and-so. And I think that people tend to be that way. We have our social groupings, and they're not always easily penetrable. And the challenge is not just for Jews of color, but the challenge is for any outsiders, but especially those who are converts, Balei Tshuva, who can't play Jewish geography with you, who don't have sort of a more intuitive feel for how Jewish communities run. It's a general problem we have, and we have to address. And however we address that, and it's a really important issue, is the same way we have to approach treating Jews of color.
Okay. I have someone who wanted to ask a question himself. Let me see if I can make this work.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. I come across in a couple of places, most notably in Rosh Zatzal's Mayan Beis HaShoeva, he quotes the Chafetz Chaim, who says that the reason Yishmael is described as Para Adam, where he says in Hebrew the adjective comes after the noun, is because the statement of the Malach was that Yishmael is fundamentally a para who happened to be in the form of an Adam, and he says explicitly, this is, I think, Rosh Schwab's terminology, that a lawyer who's a descendant of Yishmael is essentially a para who happens to be in the form of a lawyer.
Okay.
Now, what do you do with that kind of an explicit formulation?
So the answer is I'm going to respectfully dismiss it. And I don't feel the need to defend everything that came out of a certain world. If I were to sort of draw an analogy, one of my rabbeim reacted very negatively when the Cardinals came to visit YU. This happened I don't mean the St. Louis Cardinals. I mean, there was some,
I remember.
Catholic Cardinals. And his reaction to, and his view of the Catholic Church was so negative and harsh in a way that not what I've grown up with my world. I obviously don't interact with Catholics much, but it's not what I see of the Catholic Church. But my understanding of his view, I know from my father, who's his contemporary, who's a year older, my father would describe to me growing up in the South Bronx and coming home from, school on Sunday and being attacked, physically by kids who just came out of church, Irish kids who came out of church, where the pastor whipped them into a frenzy with anti-Semitic sermons. And my father happens not to share quite that negative an attitude, but I understand why someone who grew up at the time, I don't agree with it. I don't think it reflects the world of today. I don't think it's helpful. I understand why people in a certain generation might have made such comments. It doesn't mean I don't care that it's all the time. I'll state that publicly. Not everything do I think is worth publicizing. And I'll bring, so the answer is, what do I do with the answers? I don't accept it. What I will say is, in our community at least, I don't think that anybody is racist because towards Arabs or towards blacks because they read the Chafetz Chaim's comments. Do I find the comments disturbing? Yes. It also comes from a certain world. And so I'm willing to sort of set it aside respectfully.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There are these two questions, and I'm going to add maybe a little bit of commentary in this one, and I'll read these. Are you aware if there has ever been an effort in the last few decades to address this in rabbinic circles, the RCA, REITs, etc., other rabbinic groups? And a related question also, do you believe that most Orthodox Jewish rabbis are as passionate about combating racism as you are? And if yes, why are they not more vocal on this critical issue? No, and I'm going to add, don't we always talk about when there's Islamic terrorism, why don't other Muslims speak out more vocally, right? If they're against it, why don't they? And I guess you could turn that around here and say, if there's a recognition of an issue, why are our leaders not more vocal?
All right. So the answer is, I don't know that there has been a systematic effort. And I think part of the reason is to answer, not that I think rabbis shouldn't talk about racism. I think the analogy is not a great analogy. And not that I think that Islamic leaders who don't support terrorism are obligated to speak about it, but at the very least you're saying you're an advocate of your religion, and people are very publicly, if Muslims are committing acts of terrorism, you should speak up. The analog would be if Jews were joining white supremacist groups and attacking African Americans, why don't Orthodox rabbis speak about it? There's no question, there's all sorts of, I'll call economic oppression, which has come out of the Jewish community. I don't think we want to talk about the slumlords and that whole topic. I don't think living, let's say, in Teaneck, New Jersey, I'll just take it as an example. I imagine Highland Park is not so different. I don't think too many people here have any direct links, there could be indirect links, towards mistreating African Americans, at least the community. And therefore, I'm not surprised that rabbis don't see it as as so high on their agenda. I think that also sometimes rabbis shy away from, again, I don't think that all rabbis feel as strongly. There are certainly plenty who do. Some of that, and some who do talk about it. I do think that sometimes rabbis don't like to talk about topics that they're going to get a lot of pushback from the Balabatim. That may be a reflection on rabbis, but it might be a reflection on Balabatim as well. There's a Gemara in Ksubos at the beginning of the 13th parak where Abaye says that if you come to a town and there's a Talmud Chacham there who is so beloved by the townspeople, it's not because he's such a tzaddik, Abaye says, but it's because he doesn't give them musar. And that really captures, I think, a reality that has always been the case. So, I like to say when you're a rabbi and the Balabatim pay your salary, you have to be careful about what you say. So I think that sometimes rabbis are reluctant to talk about topics of that nature as well. I do believe in most cases, not all cases, that it could be spoken about more. And if it's spoken about in a nuanced and thoughtful and sensitive fashion, it's kind of hard to push back so hard. But yeah, it's something that I will say the following. There are many topics, I think, that relate to, I would say, economic justice, not only outside of our community, inside of our community, the way our community is run, that are not addressed from the pulpit very much, if at all. So there are a lot of topics that I'm often disappointed if I were to tabulate all the sermons that I've heard that I actually haven't heard addressed. It often takes an unusual public event. Let's say something, I imagine that after the killing of George Floyd, there were probably more rabbis than average who spoke about it. But I don't know of organized efforts, and I'm not saying there aren't. It just may be my narrow circle, what I do living mostly in the four walls of the Beis Medrash. and maybe really there are people engaged in extensive efforts, and I don't know why rabbis don't talk about it at least a little bit more.
Okay, I have a few more questions. I know it's running late, so we'll try to finish these that I have. So everybody, I have enough to finish, I think. Do you have any recommendations for particular books regarding African American history?
I don't. I'm sure it shouldn't be so difficult to, to do a little Googling, but I haven't done it. The book that I would, no, the answer is I don't have any recommendations. And that's not because I'm sure there's plenty of good stuff. It's just, you have to ask someone who's a historian.
Okay. Does the pasuk of Halo Atem suggest that Hashem has special relationships with other nations as well? Perhaps recognition of that recognition in Tanakh would help reduce racism.
I didn't hear the first couple of words.
Does the pasuk you quote of Halo Atem suggest that Hashem has special relationships with other nations as well?
I just want to see what was the pasuk that I quoted, unless that wasn't Halo. Can you just, I'm sorry that I'm just missing this.
That's how it's spelled here, Haloatem.
I mean, did they mean Halo Chavnei Chushim Atem Li?
Don't know.
I don't know. I'm not sure what
the answer is yes. He's turning back. Yes, that's the pasuk.
I don't know. I would say that in classic rabbinic thought, I don't think we sort of see things in that way. I do believe that seeing the Jewish people having a special relationship with God does not negate, is not meant to negate, and I think it's clear from the mission of us, universal humanity. And obviously, this has always been an anti-Semitic charge against Jews, that we view ourselves as the chosen people. And I understand why there are some Jews who take that to mean that they're special, but not, I think, in the way special that the Torah intended it. Some would say it's apologetics. I don't think this is true. Special means special responsibilities. But I'm not sure. I think certainly if you were to look at the general scope of Tanakh, I think it's hard to argue that we don't see a special relationship.
Okay, well, this is going to be our final question, and I'm going to thank you. And I mentioned that we've been recording this, and we'll do our best to get word out when it's posted. It may take a few days to post it, but we are recording this so people can get it if they would like. I've had that request, and I'll leave it on this last question. Do you see things as improving?
The question is the arc of justice right now bending? Is the arc of history right now bending towards justice? I can't evaluate whether on the ground things are improving. I do think that the last few months has brought a greater sensitivity. How that will translate into real action is harder to say, because I think that while what has received much of the attention in recent months have been issues of the criminal justice system, I think that the roots actually run much deeper. And in certain ways, I would say that the problems of the criminal justice system are almost secondary to what I would call economic injustice. And the issues of economic injustice, and this would be a completely very long share about the Torah's general view of what is an economically just society, is something that doesn't only affect minorities, it affects a large part of this country. So I think for those things to improve for the African American, for the Black community, will require it being addressed on a broader scale, not just for the Black community. And so that, I think, is something that is not going to happen overnight. I hope that it is something that receives serious attention. I don't think it's receiving the attention that it needs now. And again, it's not, I don't see this just as a problem for minority communities. It's a significant problem for a large part of Middle America as well. And when the problem is viewed through that lens, if it starts to get addressed, then it will hopefully start to be addressed for all groups, not just minority groups.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Thank you again, Rabbi Wieder, for your time and for your talk. We appreciate it.